As people are continuing to log in, let me just welcome everyone for being here today. And we can use this time for more of the introductory kinds of comments, so we can jump right into the program here in another minute or two. My name is Linda Waston from Waston and Associates, and I want to welcome you to this week's fundraising forum. This whole idea started sometime in about mid-April, I believe, when Gary Rowe from the Rock Island Community Foundation, Dave Geenan from the Day Foundation, and Paul Plagens from the Moline Foundation hosted a conference call for nonprofit individuals to just kind of talk about what's the state of fundraising and nonprofits in the community at that point in time, and to talk about what their respective foundations were doing in terms of grants for the spring. There were, I believe it was around 70 or more people on that phone call. And I know I jumped off after an hour and 15 minutes because frankly, I was hungry and wanted to go have lunch. And people were still talking. And so that kind of said that there's a need for fundraising professionals to get together, especially in this time. Fundraising, as you know, is a very lonely profession in the best of times, with usually one person in the organization having that role. And when we are in our homes and don't get to even see our coworkers, I think that makes it even more lonely. So after that first call, I reached out to those three and said, hey, it looks like there's a need to continue this. I offered to host it via Zoom so we could see faces. And then Jocelyn Rowe from AFP Quad Cities jumped in and offered to provide a lot of the marketing support. And here we are today. We had these sessions about weekly. Through the end of May. We've jumped into bi-weekly, and we are doing them bi-weekly through the end of July. At least that's the plan at this point. And on topics that, frankly, the five of us get together afterward and say, hey, what should we talk about next time? So if you have a particular topic of interest, please share it with us, and we will get that on the calendar going forward. So today's session came out of the one we had 2 weeks ago, and Matt Mendenhall asked a question of nonprofits of what were you doing in light of the civil unrest and the comments about race and racism and systemic racism. What's your nonprofit doing? And we heard crickets. And after that call, we all got on and started talking about how the nonprofit community seems to be critically important in helping communities to grow, to heal, period. And with this particular issue, it seems also very important. So as we do with all of these, we invite one or two people who have experience with the topic to share their experiences, their thoughts, to open it up for discussion. I'm hoping that we have a lot of really good discussion going. We've got 31 people on the call, so I think probably the best way to do discussion at this point is if you've got questions, please put them in the chat, either to everybody or just to me, and I will collect those and ask questions at the end. And certainly if you want to pipe in and you know, with a follow-up question, give me a holler and we can jump to you as well. Last bit of housekeeping before I turn it over is I am recording this session, and so you know, just want to let you know if you're not comfortable with that, you can certainly jump off. So our guests today are Ryan Sadler, who is the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Inclusion, and Equity at St. Ambrose University, and his counterpart from Augustana College, Dr. Monica Smith. And so I'm just going to turn it over to you guys to lead the discussion at this point. And thank you very much for joining us today. Really appreciate it. And It's all yours.
All righty. Thanks, Linda, and I appreciate it. And hello to everyone. I see some familiar faces, and some that I've never met. But I was honored to have the phone conversation with Linda after, and asking to be a part of this, and just thought that it would be best if I brought in someone with me, someone that I also think highly of. That I also think that those of us on the phone should have the opportunity to meet. And so I have Dr. Monica Smith, who's Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Augustana. And I'll allow her to introduce herself as well. But and I'm interested in your questions as opposed to me doing a lecture. And I think that's kind of where with Dr. Smith and I talked more about. And so your questions, your comments. But I'll start with a brief monologue and then turn it over to Monica to introduce herself, and then we'll go in for questions. And when I say brief, I mean brief and monologue. Something that I wrote down in my journaling book a couple of summers ago, reading up. I forget what book it was. I think it was on Bobby Kennedy, I think. And there was a quote from LBJ that struck me, and it resonates with me even to this day. When we ask the question, does systemic racism exist? We see a lot of arguments for it and a lot of arguments against it in today. But I'm just going to read this quote from LBJ that I had that kind of gets me. Actually, it was in a book from Michael Eric Dyson. It says, if you can convince the lowest white man he's better than the best colored man, he won't notice you're picking his pocket. He'll give you somebody to look down on, and he'll empty his pockets for you. And that was a quote by LBJ. W.E. Du Bois called that the psychological wage of whiteness. W.E.B. also said, that was of course previous, but W.E.B. Du Bois said that he's quoted, either the U.S. will destroy ignorance, or ignorance will destroy the United States. And I think our lack of history, our lack of understanding, we're on a great path of destroying the United States, because we've allowed our country, we've allowed the history in our educational institutions to not be taught in its most comprehensive manner. So now we all, to this day, each and every one of us on this phone, we battle with history that we are now learning, and we're fact checking, we're going to see its source. Boy, did this really happen? And we feel awful about some of the history that we are now learning. Some of it is in our own community, in the Quad Cities, that we learn of slave trade activities. We learn of slaves. Iowa was a free state. Of slaves dying. There's articles of slaves dying on Oneida Street, 900 block of Oneida Street, from moving a house up a hill. And it's our history that we don't realize and we don't know. And so we look at the problems that we see today that has brought us probably to this conversation. What's police brutality against Black Americans. And it's led to a lot of debates on, is systemic racism a problem, with some of our key government officials saying that it's not, and others. And in my analogy, it's like looking at a problem that manifests itself way downstream. And so we're dealing with something that we're trying to put a Band-Aid on a cancer when we really need to go to the root of the problem and look at the root of the problem. And that is something that each and every one of us, because we are people of power, either you are writing grants or funding grants, you are influencing either how people think, feel, or believe about different people. And so we put a lot of money where we can understand. And so we may put a lot of money on food, on clothing, on those essential things. To me, I ask the question: wouldn't this world be a great world if we didn't need a food bank? Wouldn't this world be a great place? Wouldn't the Quad Cities be a great place if we didn't need secondhand stores? And you know, and I'll end with this, with my quote from Dr. King that says, "True compassion is more than flinging a coin to a beggar, but it comes to see that the edifice that created the beggar needs restructuring." And so that is what we're up against, is a restructure, which that restructure happens on an individual level before it can happen on an organizational level. So I will leave my brief monologue to that. Dr. Smith, go ahead. I'll let you go.
Well, good morning, everyone. And thank you so much, Ryan, for thinking of me for this conversation. Certainly, these are the kinds of conversations that are both tough conversations to have, but they're necessary. And they're also the kinds of conversations that get me up in the morning. I am a justice advocate. I am a trained social worker. And so for me, it's always about shifting or changing the systems that impact the people that are served by those systems. And if and when there is a disconnect or disharmony, I've always taken the position to stand in the middle and to be able to bridge the gap, if you will. And sometimes bridging that gap, most times bridging that gap begins with increasing people's awareness and educating people. And so I think that the time that we have here today offers that opportunity. And so just again, thank you for the invite. I am the Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at Augustana College. I've been in the Quad Cities for about 2 years. Actually made the trek to the Midwest from the East Coast because of the position at Augustana. Augustana is a longstanding institution, 160 years old. We just had a recent birthday. And Augustana took its own inventory in terms of recognizing where it stands in terms of race relations and other marginalized identities, and had a very introspective and transparent conversation amongst themselves before they decided that they needed someone to help them to get to where they wanted to be, to live out their mission. And my hope and my challenge for each of you today that are representing the 30 or so organizations on this call is that you will be encouraged, prompted, forced, if you will, to do the same thing, to look at where you might be doing very well, but to really take a critical lens to where you may be missing the mark. Ryan's comments really resonated with me. I think we are at a time in our country where we are all been forced to have a discussion about race. And normally when we have discussions about race, the persons that we are having the discussions about and the persons that we often seek out to have those discussions are often Black and brown people, those who identify other than non-Hispanic white. But we're at a time now where we really have to enter white, or as Ryan and other scholars talk about, have whiteness enter the conversation. And we're not just talking about white individuals, but we're talking about really in this country, what it means to identify as white. We're talking about a population of people who have, since our country's founding, if you will, have had access and social advantages, access to all of society's goods and services, right? And others other groups have had to fight for those same kinds of entitlements. And so that's what we mean by whiteness. What meaning our society has historically and has continued, right, to add to racial identities. And so we're forced to have this particular conversation nationwide. I think, and I've said this before, that one of the things that COVID-19 has done, because so many of us were forced to be at home and watched perhaps more television than we normally would, was as a nation, we've seen with our own eyes some of the realities of what it means to be Black and brown in America. We've seen some of the disparities with respect to treatment of individuals, how people encounter law enforcement and what some of those end results are. And if you're continuing to follow, or you've been encouraged to do some reading or research on your own, you'll recognize that there have been huge disparities in the treatment, right? The amount of contact that people have, and often with those outcomes. And so for me, that's a silver lining, because it helps us to have the conversation and to move it forward. But it also, again, recenters, if you will, our lens toward whiteness, or what many call today white privilege. In fact, W.E.B. Du Bois' quote that Ryan talked about, this psychological wage of whiteness, really was around this whole concept of privilege that many of us understand today. The other piece that resonated with me with what Ryan said was the connections, right, in the Quad Cities. Often we think, when we usually talk about issues of race, the historical impact of race, that's kind of left in the Civil War, and we talk about the North and the South, and we don't recognize, right, that nationwide there have been these historical issues that continue today. And one of the things that I've recently learned is that Dred Scott has a connection to the Quad Cities. I think the QC Times has recently put an article. Jane, I see you shaking your head. It was in the QC Times, is that right? I think it was recently in the QC Times, but what did you say, Jane?
Oh, just that connection, the Dred Scott case taking place on the Arsenal. You know, that's our local. I'm just agreeing with, that's all.
Yeah, fair enough. It's good to see you. So those things really resonate with me, and I've seen a couple of the questions in the chat. So it feels like you all are asking, well, what do we do, right? And I think that's where we've been for weeks now. People are asking, what do we do? At least this is what I've been hearing, right? What do we do? How do we impact this? And I've been having conversations with people and asking them to start with the hard why, right? As companies, organizations have begun to create diversity statements. Some have, included Black Lives Matter, in those statements, and stating their commitment and their solidarity. I challenged people to ask the hard why. Why do you care? Why do you stand in solidarity, right? What's in it for you and your company, right? Because we need to get to a point in our nation and in the Quad Cities where we move away from the empathic outreach and outpouring. It's appropriate, don't get me wrong, but it becomes rhetoric over time if we continue to respond with statements and our organizations aren't shifting in ways that make those statements a reality. So why are we writing these statements because it's the right thing to do? And what do we do after that? So why is it important to you? And that's rhetorical for today, right? But when you go back to have your staff meetings, why is it important to you? Why is it important for your company? Why do you need to make that statement? Why are you committed to diversity and inclusion? it's being able to answer that question, the what's in it for me, that I think organizations have not done enough of yet. Ryan, it looks like you're going to say something.
No, I just moved to my chat so I can see the questions.
Gotcha. Got you. So those are some of the questions that I've been hearing. You know, what do we do now? And I think some of you have that in your chat features too. And I'm certainly ready to answer that. But I don't have philosophical responses. What I'll have is more of the very practical, pragmatic responses. And you'll leave probably with the question about whether or not you're committed to making some of the changes that make a difference. So I'm just going to pause there. And I guess, Linda, you're moderating. Do you want to ask some questions now, or people give some feedback or thoughts about what either Ryan or I have shared so far?
And I'm happy to. And if you have a question that you don't want to put publicly, you don't want your name or your organization affiliated with it, you can also send those to me privately, and I will ask the question without identifying your organization. But Gary put the first question up about what can funders do? How can funders ensure equity in their funding decisions?
So I'll take a stab, and then let the practical come from Monica. I think at the basis of this for me is the comfort level there as so are decisions being made about people or for people, I guess, when we talk about equity and decisions and funding things. Do you have a good representation, a fair representation of those that you're making funding decisions for at the table? The difference between, I'll say, Black and brown people and wherever it is on in terms of socioeconomic status, and poor people is for me, a lot of Black and brown people are guilted into feeling like what you're doing is a handout. And when you hand out, it comes with some attachment to it of, if I give you this money, then this is what's expected. It's not like it's plainly mentioned. It's not that's mentioned, but that's, and probably to no fault of anyone on this call, but it's how the culture and where we've grown to, and that has lived within the Black and brown community. And so I speak a lot about trust, and whenever I get a chance to talk in front of people, how do we begin to build those trust relationships? To me, that is the foundation for relational people. That's how you begin to make sure that there's equity in the funding decisions that you make. Is that we're making decisions with you. I'm not going to strip your power from you by granting the money. That's easy, as Dr. King, right? To fling a coin to a beggar, that's easy. But the more difficult work and the heavy lift is looking at why do we have it? I'm sure many of you heard the piece where I'll make it brief. The piece where someone said a gentleman's on the river, and we'll say the Mississippi River down at Centennial Park, and they see a baby floating down the river, and they go in and get it, and then they see another baby, and then they see two more. At some point, someone needs to ask the question, where are these babies coming from? Why are these babies all in the river? And so someone needs to go upstream and figure out who in the heck is putting babies in the river. That's where the source needs to be. And that's my point in terms of the equity in funding it's a decision made with people, not necessarily for people. And I don't know if there's a practical example you may have, Monica. I'll let you chime in on that one.
Fair enough. I don't have a practical example. I have more questions, right? That again, people can take back. When you think about ensure equity in your funding decisions, there are a couple of questions that I have. One, do you have a diversity, equity, or inclusion platform or pillar in your strategic plan? We all know that it's the strategic plan that guides all of our funding, right? This is what holds us accountable. This is how it helps us to raise funds. So is it a part of your plan? Do you have, well, I'll just make this as a statement. Our institutions need to adopt a position of justice rather than charity. Justice changes the location of the marginalized. And so if our funding is more charitable than it is justice oriented, we continue to feed, we continue to perpetuate, if you will, the problems or the situations, right, where people find themselves having those problems. So we need to be more justice focused. If you do have, or you were to create a diversity, equity, or an inclusion pillar in your strategic plan, would your donors fund it? If so, great. If not, there are other questions that come from that, right? So if you're intentional about marginalized community, and let's just stick with race, right? Because that's kind of where we are in the nation. If it was intentional, a particular pocket of people, a marginalized community, predominantly Black or Brown community in the Quad Cities, and you said, we're gonna raise funds to do A, B, and C in this community, what would be your donors' responses? Who would be at the table, even in your organization, challenging or asking questions about why you need to do that? Why do we need to do things differently? What are the barriers that people would offer, right? Or the questions that they would ask that would become barriers. So I think those are some of the questions that you have to ask. Now, I guess put more simply though, right? How can you ensure equity in your funding decisions? Where is the most need? Justice always asks, who is the most needy, right, in a society? And those who need more ought to give more. The question becomes, what are you giving? What are you offering? Is it going to be something, again, that changes the location of the marginalized? Or is it going to continue to perpetuate the situation that they're in? And that's the huge difference between charity and justice. So I hope that answers your question to some extent, although I know that I've asked a lot more questions there too. But I want to get us to a point where we're constantly assessing who we are, how we operate, why we do what we do.
Awesome. Ryan, did you want to add anything to that?
No, I'm also reminded of Father Monsignor Madit, 2 feet of social justice that gives the same kind of analysis of one foot of the service and another foot of the institutional structural change and justice piece. So for anyone who wants to look that up, 2 feet of justice by Father Marv Madit, our very own Quad City Davenport Diocese. So
awesome, thank you. And you know, Monica, we're under no delusion that we're going to end after an hour with the answers. So I think having the questions that we need to be asking ourselves, I know me personally, I think that's incredibly helpful. So keep asking us questions. The next question we have from us is, what restructuring would you suggest nonprofits need to think about for their organizations?
That's a hard one, right? Because I'm not real sure what a particular organization looks like. And without being able to see that the structure already, it's hard to suggest where changes might be. I don't know who posed the question, if you might want to give a little bit more context to that.
Natalie?
Or can I?
Go ahead.
Can I take a stab? Can I
Yes,
take a stab maybe? Go ahead, Natalie, go ahead.
Oh, no, that's okay. I think all of our organizations need to be able to take a look at this issue, but it would be nice to have some guidance on maybe some things to take a look at within the organizations to see, like you said, if we're truly living up to what inclusivity and equality, if we're really doing what we're saying we're doing, and what kind of restructuring do we need to do within the organization to make that a reality. Thank you.
Yeah, I think in my mind, it is doing just that, and kind of what Monica kind of hit at before. So within your, so I work at St. Ambrose as the Associate Vice President for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion. I spent the last 21 years working directly in the office for students with disabilities. And I have to look at, does our mission, or does the work that I do align with our mission and vision? And so are we mission driven? And so it's the question that as an organization, and you have these board retreats, and you have these visioning boards and all these things that we do. Is equity a part of, whether it's mentioned directly or not, is that a part of your mission, your vision? Are you intentional with that? Is that what your nonprofit is about, or your financial, is that core to you all? And so some years ago at St. Ambrose, we added diversity to our mission and our vision statement. And that to me then means that we're going to make some intentional efforts then to see that happens. And so that would be a start for when you say what does the restructure look like? Is looking within. What do you look like? Are you doing what you say you're doing, or you said you were going to do? If you've shifted, which a lot of times we do, we shift into where the need is. Do we still have something lingering in our mission and our vision, or and who we say we are, that we are not intentional about and we're not paying attention to? A lot of us shifted. I mean, the funders, a lot of the work that we did in administration, it shifted to COVID-19 and how are we going to survive, one, for a lot of us. And then once we figured that out, how are we going to thrive and come out of this? What's our pathway out of this back to whatever normalcy is going to look like? And so it's fine. We all had to do that. But in the midst of this, one piece that was made clear to me was, in all the giving and all the conversation, it was still a lot towards the needy and the poor among us, those who did not have, the less fortunate among us, I should probably say, which is a broad piece, but sprinkled among that are also the other marginalized populations that may have had an impact as well. And what we've seen is that sometimes it takes a special effort to hit some populations than others. And so there have been special efforts made by, and I'm going to say Unity Point, because I sit on their community board. So I'm going to say them because I know what they do. There's been special efforts for them to do some things pre-COVID in a veteran population. And many of you have seen what they've done, and it's got national recognition. They've done some things in the Hispanic community and the Black community pre-COVID. Well, during COVID, they then decided, you know what? It looks like across the country, race and ethnicity in some areas are hit more because they value diversity and equity and looking at it across the board. But then in particular, they have already had some things that they were doing with a marginalized or ethnic diverse population. They said, is there something that they could do in response to COVID that was specific to Blacks and Hispanics in this area? And so they did. They followed up with a program through funding from John Deere, both to the Quad City area and in the Des Moines area. Again, it was already on their mind. It was already on their consciousness. It was already something that was a part of who they are as an entity. And so the restructuring means, is this equity stuff, is it a part of who you are? If not, is there a way that it can be? I mean, I think that's why you're on this call. I meet with superintendents of schools and principals, and the work that we do is one component is hiring. And so if that's a piece that we want to talk about, is hiring or getting representation from the community on your boards. That is one component that adds, and it's proven, it adds diversity to your thought. And I challenge you to try to make that happen. Try to find diversity for your boards. There are some of us that are typically called, I'll say, and some of us that are typically called can't do it all. And so we turn some things down. I tried to get information from Reverend Dwight Ford, to share with me on his board training program, and the name escapes me. I know he does it through his church and through the critical mass piece, but I think it's at 2 or 3 cohorts of individuals that he's trained to be board ready, which is something that we are conscious of in the Black community in particular. Because when we come to sit on a board, there's an expectation from within our community, and then there's this perceived expectation that white America has of us. Okay, if we want to really get real in the conversation, there's a perception that some Black Americans have of what white America thinks of us. And it's whether it's on a board or sitting in the classroom, that is our reality. And if nothing else has shown America this concept, I think the whole protest and what you're hearing, the voices come out, should tell us that. I'll stop there. I can go on. I'll stop there.
Ryan, could you just say 1 or 2 sentences just to contextualize what you mean by there's a perception in the Black community about the expectation that white Americans have of us? Should you say 1 or 2 things about that?
Yes. And so I just talked to a young man that's a graduate of St. Ambrose, and at one of the protests, and he talked about fitting in but not fitting in. And so his language, I think he's a graduate of Moline High School, his language is very proper. And so he gets from the Black community that he talks white. He gets from the white community that he doesn't fit in because of his skin color. There's this piece for us as for some of us in the Black community, that the whiteness of America has caused us to think that we need to act. It's an assimilation thing, I guess, a certain way in order to fit in to the conversation or to the fold. And if you don't, you'll be either ostracized, may be a strong word, but dismissed and not appreciated, not valued. And that's what I hear from students as I work with students. My kids are in PV schools. I work with students in Bettendorf schools, and I work with no students in the Davenport schools. And that's what I hear from students, is to feel as if they're not valued. That's what I hear from employees at companies and entities in the Quad Cities, that they don't feel their voice is valued. And so this concept of code switching that we talk about in the Black community often comes up. And so we act one way at home, and we act another way when we're out and about. And it's this mindset: how come I can't act like me wherever I am? Because I'm ostracized, or because I'm thought of as different. In that, and then disciplinary actions happen in like school and other places. Anyway, so that's, if that gives some framing to it.
It does. Thank you. It sounds like what you're talking about is being able to think about what the culture of the institution is, right? So that a person can bring their whole self to the institution, right? And all of us, I think, are bicultural, right? And there's a need to be able to do that. And sometimes there's the pressure to do that. But some of this is about cultural change. You know, we were talking about the question about restructuring, and hearing Ryan's comments just got me to think about a couple of other things. I'll champion all that you've said, Ryan, with respect to that. But the issue with staffing, I think, is important too, right? So diversity on the board. And when I say diversity, yes, diversity of thought, but representation matters. When we think about your staff and those who are decision makers, right? Those who have, you know, significant leadership positions, do they look like the community that you serve, right? Where is the representation? Now, I can't see all of the faces that are here today. But is there representation here, right? In terms of who the decision makers are, right? Who will be able to sit at that table when clients are coming into your organizations, or you're going out, or you're raising money. You know, people don't want to be tokenized. They want to be valued. And so I think it's important, this whole idea of representation does matter. And I'll stop there. We can get to the couple of other questions if there are any.
Great answers, and thank you very much for that. And there's a lot more questions coming up in the chat, but I want to make sure and ask this one so that and give you enough time to answer it, and we can pop back to another one. But back to your point, Monica, if you look on the screens, there are an awful lot of white faces. I would say 95% are white faces. Caring faces who want to do something, and I applaud everyone who took the time to be here today. This conversation is not going to end in 14 minutes when our time is up today. What can we do both within our organizations and, maybe more importantly, as a community, to continue this conversation? And you made a comment earlier, and I wrote it down, which is, you know, based upon our whiteness, how can we authentically be having these conversations and start to make these kinds of changes? After I contacted Ryan, I kept seeing a whole bunch of things saying, you know, to white people, don't come to us to solve the problem. And I thought, oops. But you know, so how can we be respectful? How can we move the conversation forward? You know, with the knowledge, my conversation with Ryan earlier, I learned so much that I don't feel like as a group of white people, we could answer the question as well as you can. So lots of stuff in there and a lot of confessions in there, but what can we do? What should we do going forward?
Ryan,
Monica, you want to? Go ahead.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Well, thank you, Linda. I appreciate the question, admissions, all of those sorts of things, and the vulnerability, even in making those really authentic statements. you know, what you're saying, I think Ryan and myself, we already know, right, that non-Hispanic whites struggle with understanding this, right? And again, what I've been hearing from a lot of Black and brown folks is that they're tired, they're exhausted, right? Experiencing racism, talking about racism, being called upon to teach people about racism, to, you know, to have these insights, that they're tired. And I know people who are professionals, you know, who do the work that I do, and they say, I'm just not doing it. I'm not lending myself again. I'm not going to give myself this additional burden of doing these kinds of community engagement things. I'm not going to re-traumatize myself by having to answer questions that people can learn about on their own. Now, this is going to be a long-winded answer because I think I need to contextualize it for you, but you know, racism is not something that Black and brown people created. You know, we were asking for citizenship. You know, when the Supreme Court was determining who could be white, that there were white men who were making those decisions, and the rest of us have kind of lived in the residue of that. But we had to figure out, well, what is this? Why does it exist? What are all the dynamics around that? And I think the same way that we've done much of this learning, many of us don't know our history. White and Blacks don't know Black history, right? But we've had to learn that. And in similar ways that Black and brown folks have lent themselves to be educated about it, to find the resources, to spend the time to understand it, that is something that non-Hispanic whites can do also. To your point, Linda, I saw all sorts of things, 75 things white folks can do to whatever, you know, 10 things white people can do, right? Conversations of about whiteness is we're going to talk about these kinds of things. It's really important. You can Google.
Monica,
Right?
you're getting really, really faded, and so like the last sentence or two we didn't really hear.
I was just saying that the expectation is that people will put themselves in a position to learn, and so you can Google, right, any of this, how to be an ally, what do white people need to do. There are books all around it. There's some. I mean, Tim Wise writes about anti-racism. Ibram X. Kendi writes about racism. Go on Amazon, really, honestly, right? And just get these books and read. There's a book called White Fragility. Like they're just texts all over, easy reads that you can do. But I think people are feeling like whites haven't put themselves in a position to learn, and instead have depended on us to do that. And that's the first call to action, right? To raise your consciousness, to raise your awareness, to increase your knowledge about these issues. And that's really hard work, because what tends to happen in times like this is that Blacks get angry because you're asking us again, and whites feel guilty. We've got to be able to bridge that divide. And we've got to work through our anger. You've got to work through your guilt, but you've got to be committed to doing it, so there's not this constant reactive kind of thing. And then when the news media wears down, when people are seeming to go back to normal, we forget about it until the next instance. And that's kind of where we are right now. So being able to learn that on your own, there are lots and lots of helps out there. I would encourage people to look for it. A couple of other things that I would say. So educating yourself, educating your staff, dedicating some time in your staff meetings to have these conversations, and not expecting Black and brown persons to lead the discussions. That's so unfair. It's so unfair. So not expecting them to lead the discussions, but also doing this in your personal time. I think another thing that you all should consider for your organizations is policy development. If 95% of the people on this call are not representative of the diversity that exists in the Quad Cities or in the population that you serve, then you should probably set a standard for yourself that you're going to increase the diversity of your staff. And I mean representation, not
You're fading out again.
you got to increase the diversity of your staff, not just, and I don't just mean diversity of thought, I mean representation, right? So that, and have people that are in decision makers, and again, avoiding kind of tokenization. And then the other question is, you know, what are we going to fund? How are we going to spend our dollars? This understanding racism and being able to get to a justice mindset is not something that you can have speakers come in every so often to do. I think that the heavy lift requires an investment. You're going to have to invest in having professional development series. You're going to have to invest in having people come in and show you some things and talk about some things. So this goes back to the question of what should we fund, right? These are really important first steps for people to be able to learn how to address these issues, because this is our shared reality. And again, what we've seen across the nation is a division that has existed in the country for a long time, and that division is the reality of the Black and Brown experience when compared to the experience of non-Hispanic ones. Does that answer your question?
You were supposed to have the magic bullet. Do this and it's all done.
Well, yeah.
I'm joking,
Yeah.
totally joking.
I like to think of myself as magical, but not not in this situation. It's hard work that has to be done. I mean, this is therapy. This is national therapy that we all need to have to understand how we got here, not try to escape it, right? Not put a Band-Aid on a wound, but this is surgery. This is surgery, and we need some of the best surgeons to do it, which is why I'm encouraging you to have someone come in and do the work with and for you.
Yeah. Can I just end with some comments that just don't be afraid to commit yourself to being a lifelong learner, I guess would be the as magic of a bullet I can give. Dismantle. Don't be afraid to dismantle what you think you know from a historical standpoint or about people. So be open. Don't be afraid to put your foot in your mouth. If it's coming from a good place within your heart, don't be afraid to say I don't know. Understand that it's about relationships. Because Linda and I have a relationship, I'm not at all bothered by her call and asking me to do this, and the conversation that we were able to have. I can tell you, if she had called me a week earlier, I probably would have not responded because I wasn't in the headspace because of where I was personally, and nothing against Linda, but because where I was personally. And so if someone that you think highly of, that you would like to have this conversation with, and they choose not to, don't force them. Just as we don't force our kids sometimes to have the conversation. Sometimes we force them to have the conversation, but we don't force them. And a saying that my grandmother would always say, well, before I say that, I'll say this. Stan Kavanaugh I see is on the line, and Stan was the dean of students at St. Ambrose when I was a student there through my time there. And one thing that I now admire about Stan that he did that I did not appreciate as a student was Stan stood up for his staff and those that reported to him, whether it was student staff or professional staff. I never heard him say a bad thing or anything undermining any one of his staff, even if they've done something wrong. I appreciate that now, but I didn't then. My grandmother used to always tell us, son, keep on living. And that's all she would say. The intention of that, or the message behind that, is we will begin to understand things better. Just keep on living. Don't be afraid. And living means don't stop learning. Don't stop learning. So don't be afraid to be a lifelong learner and keep on living.
Awesome, awesome. Anne, you have something you wanted to share. We've got about a minute or so if you can share something quickly.
I'll try. Thank you. This kind of been something I was thinking about, and then something Ryan said brought it back to my forefront. So when Ryan brought up about what funders can do and how sometimes money is given, and then that person or place or organization it's given to, there might be strings or you're guilted into receiving it or using it a certain way. And I'm not sure who everybody represents on this panel or that's listening in on the Zoom or watching, but maybe whether you're an organization or a funder, something to ask yourselves or the organization you're with is, is there something when you give money, I know it's a give and take, and you know, what are you requiring that organization or agency or person to do when they receive it? Do they have to have a commercial on TV announcing your sponsorship? Or does their name have to be on the van you're using? Or a sign in their yard or office saying? And I am most appreciative of all our funders and donors, public, private, but sometimes the stigma that comes attached to receiving help makes people not want to get help. And then we continue having people in need. And so that's just a thought I've struggled with in different roles I've played.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that thought. It's 12 o'clock. I think we could go till midnight. When Ryan and I talked, I said, I think this could be, 8-hour-long conversation, and it certainly can. And we didn't get to all of your questions, and I apologize for that. But I would say keep the conversation going. And certainly I'm happy to serve as kind of a point person to get conversation out. I won't volunteer the rest of the sponsors for this, but I'm sure they are also happy to help kind of navigate the conversation or start, matching people up to continue this conversation, because it is a very, very important one. For our organizations, for our community, for our country, and for our world. So, and as I said at the beginning, I think a lot of that starts and a lot of that change happens with the nonprofits. So this community is going to be very instrumental for making that change happen. Before we jump off, I do want to make sure to say a huge thank you to Monica and to Ryan for helping to facilitate this conversation today, for answering our questions, and putting up with all the questions that you're getting, not just from us, but from everybody in the community these days. We will have another forum. 2 weeks from today is July 1. I don't know if we've decided we're going to bump it to July 8th or not. We need to have that conversation. So watch your emails for an announcement of the next one. We're talking about economics and what's happening as we're coming out of recovery. We need to figure out what that looks like. If you've got other topics, if you've got, other questions on some of the topics we've had, including today's, because we've had great conversation and great participation, please send those to any of the sponsors as well. So thank you very much. Special thank you, Ryan, Monica, but thank you to all of you for being here, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you, guys.
Paul, Gary, Dave, can you stick around for a minute? All right, we lost Jocelyn, so we can assign her the next one.
That'll teach her.
Is Dave still there? I thought I could unmute. There you go.
No, Dave had to leave. This is a mutual from Community Caring Conference.
Okay. Okay.
But thanks.
I saw Dave. I didn't think you were Dave. I didn't know if he was still hanging around. Okay.
He had to leave.
We can
All
assign
right,
him
then I'm
stuff
gonna-
too. Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.